On April 8, 2010, the United States and Russia signed the New START Treaty, under which the U.S. and Russia would both reduce their tactical nuclear and intercontinental ballistic missile counts. However, it was clear from the conditions under which the treaty was signed that this was not the strategic agreement that had been hailed by Obama, but a compromise. The Russians had made two things absolutely clear. First, if the U.S. implemented any anti-missile defense systems, the Russians would withdraw from the treaty. And second, if the United States pursued regime change in Iran, the Russians would also back out of the treaty. The simple fact of the matter is that the Russians don't trust the United States. But if you were Russia, would you trust the United States? Over the past year, the Obama administration has been on a warpath to implement the British-modeled Nazi healthcare reform, despite the clear opposition from more than 60% of the American people. But the greatest point of contention between the United States and Russia today is the U.S. protection of the Afghan opium crop, which funds the logistical base of operations not just for the Taliban, but for all international terror, including the terrorists who carried out the Moscow metro suicide bombings. For the Russians, the British-directed Afghan opium operation is more than just a terrorist threat. Last year, 30,000 Russians between the ages of 18 to 24 died as a result of the catastrophic epidemic of heroin addiction, which is infecting Russia, with a further 2.5 million Russians ages 18 to 40 addicted to opiates. This is a mortal threat to the Russians, and this is the point that Viktor Ivanov made in his speech back in March, where he demanded that the U.S. reverse Obama's policy of no eradication in Afghanistan. The State Department, under the direction of Hillary Clinton, has made some useful steps in working with the Russian government on this issue, particularly with the recent efforts on the reversal of Obama's opium protection policy. But the Russians have some problems of their own. Beginning in 1983, under Yuri Andropov, the Soviets rejected Reagan's proffer of LaRouche's Strategic Defense Initiative, which was a proposal for joint collaboration with the Soviet Union. This proposal called for the innovation of laser-based strategic defense systems geared in the direction of rendering nuclear weapons and ICBM technologies impotent and obsolete. But that wasn't all. The goal of the Mutual Strategic Defense Initiative was a collaborative effort by the U.S. and Russia to revitalize both economies as the product of a science-driven mission. This offer represented the one and only chance for the end to the mutually assured destruction doctrine, and to rescue both the economies of the East and the West from the collapse of their respective systems. Once that offer was rejected, the Soviets went full steam with an attempt to mobilize their economy for military buildup, which ended as LaRouche had forecast in the collapse of the Comecon system from 1989 to 1991. In the years between Andropov's rejection of the SDI in 1983 and the breakup of the USSR in 1991, a group of young members of the Soviet elite had been dispatched with the approval and sponsorship first of Andropov and then of his successor, Mikhail Gorbachev, for training in systems analysis and radical free trade economics. Where were they trained? In London, of course, by British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher's economic gurus, and in places like Budapest, Hungary, and especially the International Institute of Applied Systems Analysis, or IASA, near Vienna, Austria. From the British imperial standpoint, the goal was to secure a faction inside of Russia that would resist policies of sovereign nation-state development, and instead work from the inside to set up the looting of that nation's vast physical resources for the benefit of a global monetarist system. It was for promoting this agenda that Gorbachev qualified himself as a traitor to the Soviet Union. Then, when he was ousted at the end of 1991, the so-called Young Reformers took over the government of Russia. These were people like Yegor Gadar, Alexei Kudrin, Anatoly Chubais. As the leading officials of the new Russian government, the Gadar-Chubais group saw the looting policy through in its most radical form. During the 1990s, their shock therapy and structural reform opened up Russia's physical economy as a looting ground to finance the global monetarist empire, and the horrific expansion of drug traffic and addiction inside Russia is only the most lurid outcome of this process. Despite the efforts of Russian leaders such as Yevgeny Primakov, and then Vladimir Putin and his allies to reverse the worst destruction of the Russian economy, the faction most responsible for destroying Russia's potential from the inside is still at it today. Finance Minister Alexei Kudrin is just one of a treasonous faction now intending to thrust Russia into the failed monetary union of the British-run BRIC. This is the same Kudrin who is cutting funding to Russian railways and other national infrastructure projects in pursuit of outdoing the European Union's Maastricht conditionalities by demanding that Russia's budget deficit be no greater than 1% of GDP. By these measures, Kudrin is diverting much of the capital generated from Russia's physical economy towards speculation and the black market. In effect, the financial capital of Russia today is in the Cayman Islands. 90% of Russia's major privatized companies have their legal registration in British-controlled offshore territories, depriving the Russian federal budget of tax revenue and setting up the absurd situation in which half of foreign investment in the country actually comes from those offshore registered Russian companies, a group that includes some of Russia's biggest steel, aluminum, oil, and energy businesses. What the Russians have to understand, and what we must understand, if we grasp the historical importance of Russian-American cooperation on strategic matters, is that the British financial system, with which they are currently aligning themselves, is hopelessly bankrupt. Therefore, banking offshore and proposals like the BRIC are not viable partnerships between nations. They're simply an attempt by international finance to get national economies to bail their sorry British asses out. Relations between the U.S. and Russia have been a string of less than stellar compromises for the past 10 years and beyond. It is clear that the Russians do not trust Obama, and to the extent that the Russians have lined up with the British on the question of globalization, they have also lined up against the patriotic tendencies within the United States. However, at the time that Lyndon LaRouche had proposed his Mutual Strategic Defense Initiative, there was a real agreement among government circles in Russia who saw this as an honest move toward collaboration. With the impeachment of Obama, who for all intents and purposes has acted as a British puppet, the patriotic elements who have pushed for honest Russian collaboration can, in the spirit of the SDI, work with the Russians now to end international terror. This means an immediate, all-out eradication of the opium crops and an immediate withdrawal of the presently targeted U.S. troops in Afghanistan. Without the funding to operate, international terror can be immediately dealt with, and the British system that thrives on Afghan drug trade will experience a new type of shock and awe. If Russia were to see a United States that was honestly committed to returning to its patriotic roots and splitting from its current policy of protecting the British-run dope trade, the potential for both nations to break with their historic enemy and implement a global Glass-Steagall would be the immediate political reality. In the United States, Glass-Steagall reaffirmed the constitutional right of the U.S. government to regulate its economic activity and effectively split Wall Street investment banking and speculation from the legitimate commercial banking practices that promote local business, industry, and agriculture. In that same vein, Russia will have to separate its offshore speculative element to take control and engage the productive end of many of its industries. A Glass-Steagall for Russia would not only freely allow the types of cooperation that began at the Rhodes Conference when they engaged China in cooperative rail development, but would serve to make infrastructure, power, and scientific development the standard for what's known as economic activity. With a global iteration of Glass-Steagall to separate the monetary junk from the physical economy, the Atlantic-centered financial parasite can be dealt with in legal fashion, with those who have supported globalized looting facing a Nuremberg trial, while the legitimate physical economic capacity of nations can be enforced by a system of international credit.